JAC.
You just made one?
Steve, we just made a commercial for the Jeep.
That's what we
You
do.
see, when there's no time, we have to make time in life. Now,
Magic.
I'll tell you something. This was a genius idea now. This is even better.
Go back 10 minutes when I first suggested this, and Cyrus's reaction was like, yeah, it's a great idea. Friend Cyrus from Euro Prestige Imports, an unknown of Charlotte. We have a great friendship and a great working relationship, and we're in your world headquarters today, Cyrus. And James, if we spin round, Cyrus can tell us a little bit about what we're going to be looking at, a little bit about what it is.
Well, apparently we'll be looking around this thing, but somehow, I don't know what, he has something different in mind.
We're not going to be looking at this.
So we do all this and we're not going to be presenting my Apocalypse 6x6?
It's a beautiful thing, and we will be doing an episode on the test piece for reveal. It's a reveal show. Cyrus, would you please remove
Jesus
the magic show?
So he's in retirement.
You remove the Apocalypse?
And yeah.
Oh, do you want me to help you move it?
Yeah, maybe just try. Yeah, it ain't gonna work. Okay,
no,
I need
no
to
way.
actually push this thing myself.
There's no way that's gonna happen.
It's not gonna work. Okay. James, I don't know why Steve makes things so complicated.
This is a 1942 Ford GPW. It is from my own personal collection, and it's a Jeep from the Second World War. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, and we do want to do a future episode on this very Jeep. But today's episode is not about this Jeep. No. So Cyrus,
episodes of this Jeep. He actually did talk a lot about it. But
not on my channel.
It's not a Jeep, it's actually a Ford, okay?
It's a Ford GPW.
Yes, he will bring it up.
No.
Very close future. So,
but it's not. Our episode today is not about this Jeep. So can
I'm going to push this one too.
Right. But this is what is finally revealed. This is the subject of today's Steve Matchett Does Something YouTube channel show. This beautiful machine is a 1983 Italian scooter known as a Lambretta. Actually, this one was manufactured in India by Scooters India Limited, because by the time this machine was made in 1983, Lambretta production in Italy had stopped. Now, why, all fun aside, are we using the Jeep, the Apocalypse Jeep and the Second World War Jeep to reveal the Lambretta? It's because there is a connection between the two. And James, I'm just going to walk back over to the Jeep and try and give you that link between these two marvelous machines. This machine, the Second World War Jeep, was designed, manufactured and utilized by the Allied forces in the Second World War to effectively destroy the fascist governments of both Italy and Germany in the European theatre of operations and bring to a close the Second World War. And this vehicle proved absolutely key and played a crucial role in the Allies' very swift, relatively swift victory in Europe. Now, we know that the Normandy landings happened in June 1944 and the collapse of Berlin was May 45, so it's basically just 1 year after. But the Italian campaign happened the year before the Normandy landings in 1943. And such was the rate of progress, with the Italians being pushed back and the German forces being pushed back towards the German border up in the north of Italy. This machine was put to great use by the Allied forces. However, one other machine that was used to great effect in that Italian campaign was known as the Cushman Airborne. And it was basically a little motorcycle. Looked very much like a scooter. Small wheels, leg shields, chain driven, and it was used by the airborne forces and all the Allied forces in general actually for swift transport around the streets and roads of Italy. And such was the rate of progress through the Allied forces moving through Italy that a lot of these Cushman airborne motor scooters were simply abandoned by the Allied forces because they were moving too fast to take them with them. So a lot of these machines were abandoned, and the local families in all the towns and cities and villages that were liberated by the Allied forces took advantage of these Cushman airborne motorcycles and used them as daily transport, effectively free transport, because they were abandoned by the Allied forces. But because the design of the Cushman airborne had an open area in front of behind the leg shields in front of the seat, it enabled women who at that point were not used to riding motorcycles, quite frankly, because of the crossbar arrangement of a motorcycle. Women back then simply didn't really use motorcycles. They were very much a masculine machine. It was a very different time. We can't apologize for history. History is what it is. But because of the high rate of casualties in the war and the loss of many men from families, the women of the families had to play a much bigger, crucial role in keeping the family working and living together. And so they started to use the Cushman Airborne to get around. All of a sudden, women were using transport in a way that they simply hadn't used before. Now, let's move over to our Lambretta here, and I'll tell you a little bit about this and the connection to the Cushman and why I find it such a fascinating machine. So the Cushman Airborne was basically a very similar design to this. Here's this open area here behind the leg shields and in front of the seat, which allowed women wearing dresses and skirts to be able to easily use the transport. In a way, it was like, go back to a bygone age and women riding side saddle on a horse. It simply wasn't done for women to straggle across a horse. It wasn't done in Italy at the time for women to straggle across a crossbar of a frame of a motorcycle. This design suddenly opened up that possibility to women of that time to be able to use it. Great idea. So this machine, the Lambretta, is the brainchild of Ferdinando Innocenti. And Ferdinando Innocenti was the son of a blacksmith around Milan in the pre-war days in Italy. And Ferdinando learned his love of the forge and of blacksmithing and the love of metalwork through his father's work as a blacksmith. So it's no surprise that in later years Ferdinando Innocenti started up his own metalworking business, and his speciality was making steel tubes. And in the years just preceding the Second World War in the 30s, under Mussolini's government in Italy, there was a lot of very lucrative government contracts as the governments were gearing up for war, frankly. But during the war and right up towards the end of the war in 44, 45, a lot of the Italian infrastructure was destroyed by bombing, as the Allied forces realized that the easiest, perhaps the most effective way of bringing the war to an end was to destroy the infrastructure, the factories of both Italy and Germany. And we know that the RAF and the American Air Force dropped huge amounts of bombs, munitions onto both of those countries to destroy many factories. We know that, and if you can't produce U-boats and ships and tanks and trains and armored cars, you can't wage war. And that was the Italians' approach, the Allies' approach to bringing to an end the Second World War. And it worked relatively well. It was a terrible, terrible business. Of course it is. World War is a terrible business, but it did bring the war to a relatively swift close. Now, after the war, Ferdinando Innocenti's factory was completely destroyed by bombing just prior to the end of the war. But after the war, Ferdinando was thinking, how can we rejuvenate Italian industry? How can we get it back on its feet? And he'd seen so many of the families using these abandoned Cushman airborne machines in Italy that he thought, wait a moment, I think we could probably produce something very similar to that and go into production making motor scooters. Now, in terms of motor scooters, there's really only two names you may have heard of. The biggest of those two names, in my opinion, would be Vespa, and Lambretta is the smaller concern. But Vespa and Lambretta share many, many similarities. They look very similar to begin with. And also, I understand that many of the designers that worked on Vespa also worked on Lambretta, so you can see that common crossover of design. But I particularly like the Lambretta engineering. I like the Lambretta story because it's less well known than the Vespa, but I like the engineering as well. So let's have a look around this machine and I'll tell you a little bit that I know. Lambretta and Vespa both set about producing their machines with the idea of keeping all the oily components, the engine, the transmission, the chain and all that, the drivetrain, hidden out of sight. So once again, to encourage women to use these machines and stay relatively clean. That was a concern at the time, and I understand why they wanted to do that. So all of the drivetrain and everything is hidden underneath these panels. And we'll take those panels off and I'll show you what's hidden underneath. The transmission is operated via the headset here, and there are 4 gears, and you operate the gears by simply moving the left handlebar through a series of clicks and detents to change the transmission, and the transmission is changed via cable. Now I'll come around here and just take off one of the panels so you can get an idea of just how everything works on this machine, and I'll show you one of the main differences between Lambretta and Vespa in the basic design of the frame and the chassis. These side panels are relatively easy to get off. There's just one catch at the back and then they lift off, revealing all that's hidden underneath there. We can see a tool storage box, the fuel tank, the air cleaner and the engine. So on this side, James, when we look down here, Lambretta decided to put a little storage compartment at the front behind the leg shields, and at the time you could put whatever was needed in there, passport or identification documents after the end of the Second World War, and later on that would just go to wallets and keys and anything else that you needed to store. But that right there, this component here, is the little storage compartment. So if we lift the seat up, this little catch here is for the fuel tank. We've got to put the fuel in, once again, hidden out of sight from the user. And the fuel tank is this wonderful stainless steel tank hidden right here. Here's our luggage compartment, such as it is. Here's our air tank right here, air filter element, an air box feeding down into the carburetor mounted down here, and again the fuel tank right behind. And the air inlet for the air box and down into the filter is right here, once again hidden under the seat. So air inlet is through here, through this ducting, down into the air box, through quite a substantial air filter, and then running down through the rubber hose connector onto the carburetor. I'll show you a little bit about how the engine is mounted and the transmission. So it's a single cylinder air-cooled design. This model of Lambretta is a GP150, so it's 150cc. About 8.5 to 9 horsepower is all it is, with 4 speeds through the transmission. Here's all the cabling required to change the clutch, to engage the clutch and also to change gear. And down here you can just see the shroud for the single cylinder, and then the cooling fins on the cylinder down here. This is what I was talking about, like the main tube of the frame of the Lambretta is a single piece that starts up at the headset, comes round where the leg shields are, underneath here and back up, and finishes behind the seat post. Now that's key, because remember what I was saying earlier on about Ferdinando Innocenti learning his metalworking craft from his father as a blacksmith, and the fact that he had a steel tube business, and the steel tube design he incorporated into the Lambretta design so that it would keep his knowledge of manufacturing current. Vespa, in contrast, designed their scooter somewhat differently. They didn't use that same tube design in the frame. They used a pressed steel design and basically just pushed the two sides of the bodywork together. But the other main engineering difference between Lambretta and Vespa is Lambretta, as you can see, have all the components of their drivetrain sitting more or less virtually straight down the center line of the frame. And in engineering terms, that's where you want it to be. It doesn't matter if it's a Formula One car or a road car or a simple motor scooter. Physics is physics and science is science, and you want the mass of the components to be sitting right on the center line as much as possible. It gives a better balanced machine. And that's what Lambretta did with their design. Vespa, in contrast, put all their engine and transmission design on one side. And if you look at Vespa design, you'll see that they have a much sort of wider side panels in comparison to Lambretta, and that is because the cylinder and the transmission sit out here. Now that means that there's not an awful lot on the other side of a Vespa in contrast to a Lambretta. because of Lambretta's engineering is straight down the center line. So on the left side of a Vespa, they use all of that empty compartment simply for storage. So you don't have a storage compartment on a Vespa in the same way that you do at the front of a Lambretta. The Vespa storage is all in this open space around here. Relatively small wheels, up to 36 psi in the tires, but it gives this wonderful stylish solution to their engineering. I think that's another reason why I am attracted to Lambretta engineering, because it's almost like a work of art, especially when you look around where everything fits around here. There isn't a spare inch, absolutely everything. The three main components up the top, the storage compartment, the airbox and the fuel tank, sit absolutely perfectly just where they should be. Again, the air inlet is underneath here, but when you put the seat down and the fuel tank inlet is here, all of that is hidden away, and the rear brake just one pedal down on the footboards there. So everything is kept relatively clean. Now, we're going to step away a couple of minutes to commercial break. But when we come back, I'll try and fire this Lambretta into life, and you'll hear the very distinctive, unique sound that a Lambretta makes. And I know of no other motorcycle or motor scooter that shares that sound. Vespa is somewhat similar, but Lambretta has a unique sound. When we come back, I'll let you hear it.
So this is the Apocalypse 6x6 Hellfire, sitting right next to a Ford GPW from 1942. Looks a little small, right? Imagine Jeep started right here. That's where it all was created. And with time and age, they went a little bit crazy. So there's a company called Apocalypse who decided to take just basically the Jeep Gladiator and totally change it. There's nothing was pretty much left from Jeep. This is the animal. This is the beast. You could find it at Euro Prestige Imports, or simply look it up at apocalypse6x6carolina.com. If you want to simplify it, apocalypsecarolina.com. Enjoy. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Welcome back. Before we went to commercial break, I said we'd let you have a listen to the unique sound of the Lambretta engine. Now, James, if you look down here, let's just work you through these wonderful controls to enable us to do that. We have down here the fuel tap on and off, and down is on, and that allows fuel to flow from our stainless fuel tank down into the carburetor. And this other little chrome handle on the side is a choke. Today should be warm enough that we don't need that. We'll see. They are notoriously difficult to fire into life sometimes. Ignition switch is simply on here with a key, and let's see if we can get it to go. The roar, the mighty roar of the untamed Lambretta. Now, there are two things I just want to point out before we close out this episode. We talked earlier on about Ferdinando Innocenti, his engineering prowess and his knowledge that he learned in the pre-war years, and then his contracts with the government during the war years, and then the eventual bombing of his factory, and then trying to re-establish Innocenti as a company after the war by using the Lambretta. The very early Lambrettas that started in 1947. Vespa started production in 46, if I remember right. Lambretta in 47. The very early Lambrettas looked distinctly more like the Cushman airborne scooter from the American forces and the Allied forces, and only later did they take on this very stylish design that we see today. If you think that the front suspension, the front wheel and the front suspension treatment looks a little bit like landing gear off an aircraft in the Second World War, you're right, because that's exactly where the engineering idea came from for Ferdinando Innocenti, from his knowledge of aircraft in the Second World War. So here it is, the Lambretta GP150, a fun, simple little machine with a great story. And I love the story about Ferdinando Innocenti re-established Innocenti engineering and brought them back to prowess and managed to continue to find employment for the families after the close of the Second World War. So next time you see a Lambretta, have a look at this little badge right here on the front. Here's the Lambretta badge, which will give it away, of course, that it is a Lambretta with that very distinctive design anyway. But right here, underneath the light, you'll see an ellipse with a little eye in it. And that, it stands for Innocenti. Ferdinando Innocenti, the brainchild of the Italian Lambretta scooter. Join us again on another episode of Steve Matchett, does something.